Welcome back to the fourth session of the day. On behalf of JLF Colorado, Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, Festival producer Sanjay K. Roy, and all my colleagues at Team Arts, Boulder Public Library, and the City of Boulder, we welcome you to this session of JLF Colorado 2021 Virtual Festival. This red line goes straight to your heart. Madhur Anand in conversation with Malashri Lal, introduced by Sylvain Fabi, Consul General of Canada in Denver. The line which separates science from sentiment, living memory from the written word, and the parent from progeny are as adamant as the convictions of those who align with either of the opposite camps. Writer and academic Madhur Anand redefines lines as threads. In this red line goes straight to your heart. Threads which enhance the understanding of opposites and reveal their curious closeness. In conversation with writer Malashri Lal, Anand discusses her memoir of Halves, an exceptional blend of science, history, and poetry, and the value of an interdisciplinary approach to writing. Madhur Anand's participation is sponsored by the Consul General of Canada in Denver. Madhur Anand. Madhur Anand is the author of the book of poems, A New Index of Predicting Catastrophes, and the experimental memoir, This Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart. Both considered trailblazing in their synthesis of the art and science. A New Index was a finalist for the Trillium Book Award for Poetry. This red line won the Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction in 2021. She's a professor of ecology and sustainability at the University of Guelph and was appointed the inaugural director of the Guelph Institute of Environmental Research. Malashri Lal. Malashri Lal, an academic, editor, and writer with 16 books to her credit, retired as Professor, Department of English, University of Delhi. Her specialization is in literature and gender studies. She is currently member English Advisory Board, Sahitya Akademi, and serves on the advisory committee of 3 international journals. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on upcoming sessions. In these difficult times, we have struggled to bring you JLF Colorado without charging a registration fee. Please support as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. Simply click on the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your contribution is greatly appreciated. Before we start the session, may I please invite Sylvain Fabi, Consul General of Canada in Denver, to say a few words.
Hello and bonjour. My name is Sylvain Fabi, and I'm the Consul General of Canada for the U.S. Mountain West region, based at the Consulate General of Canada in Denver. The Consulate is excited to once again partner with the Jaipur Literary Festival to support 2 incredible Canadian artists whom it will be my honor to introduce to you in a moment. The Government of Canada is always proud to support the arts, particularly stories created and told by diverse voices that have the power to open our eyes to new ideas and perspectives that broaden how we understand and live in this world. Why? Because art is activism. Stories have the power to capture our thoughts, our emotions, and help us better understand and relate to one another. And I'm excited to introduce 2 Canadian authors with us at this year's festival. The first is Samra Zafar. She's an award-winning speaker, author, consultant, educator, and entrepreneur. Her memoir, The Good Wife, Escaping the Life I Never Chose, describes how she escaped an abusive child marriage to pursue her education and build her own future. She has been recognized among the top 100 most powerful women in Canada. And joining us is Dr. Heart-Madhur Anand, a professor of ecology and sustainability at the University of Guelph. Her experimental memoir, This Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart, gives an account of 3 generations of her family, touching on partition, immigration, science, and poetry. It won the Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction in 2020. So I thank each of you in the audience for joining us for Jaipur and these important author conversations. Enjoy the festival.
Thank you, Sylvain Fabi, and the entire Office of the Consul General of Canada in Denver for the support towards the festival. We really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, this red line goes straight to your heart. Madhur Anand in conversation with Malashri Lal. Over to you, Malashri.
Madhur Anand, a great pleasure to meet you. Congratulations on writing a very engrossing and a most unusual memoir. The Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart has a subtitle which I find quite fascinating because it says it's a memoir in halves. And there are two parts to it structurally, but they are integrated in terms of the way in which you interpret the idea of the red line and the way you make connections between so-called diverse aspects of science, biography, history, culture, etc. So I want to first begin by thinking a little more about the red line. The sweep of your novel is large. You begin with the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, and the story comes right up to 2019. And you seem to suggest that the red line is real as well as imaginary. The reference, of course, historically is to Radcliffe's red line on a British map of the subcontinent. But the red line is also another one which invisibly or visibly divides people. So would you say that the idea of the partition, metaphorically and in real terms, is at the core of your understanding of the red line as such? And the book is about different kinds of halves, different kinds of divisions, and the possibility of unification.
Yes, first of all, Malashri, and to the festival, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Hello to Boulder. It's a great honor to be with you. You have nailed, the exact themes of the book correctly. I might say a little bit about that line because when I first encountered it, it was on a map, of course, the red line, the Radcliffe line, and I saw it on a map. It came through some of my research that I was doing many years ago, just trying to understand the geography, basic geography of that line, and I printed out the map, and it happened to be drawn in red in the map, the version that I looked at, and I put it up on my door in my office, and I forced myself to look at it daily. And the line is not a straight line. And, many people have written about the Radcliffe line, and I read quite extensively about it. And one of the, I think, issues of that line that, was drawn fairly arbitrarily to divide the continent and caused, of course, one of the greatest human catastrophes in history. It's very crooked. It's a very crooked line. It's not a straight line. And that started to fascinate me on many levels. I had been reading a lot of nonfiction and fiction and poetry that was trying to deal with the historic and long-term impacts of partition. But of course, being a scientist, the line kind of captured my imagination from a completely other perspective. I looked at it and I looked at it because I spend my time looking at lines. I spend my time making lines, making graphs. And when I make lines and I draw lines, it's to study ecological systems, and they're never straight. They're never simple. And I try to understand the axes, the X and the Y. So it was the crookedness of that line that at first drew me into using it as a metaphor for partition more broadly. And so that's why when you read the memoir, you'll see that it does have a kind of fractal quality. Because, you know, if you look at a line and if it's not going to be straight, the more complex it gets, the more it starts to fill out that two-dimensional space, the more it becomes a fractal line.
I find that absolutely fascinating because the first part has a lot about the father figure, and he has a limp, and he has an interest in physics. So, what you're saying about the crooked line and the way it complicates our idea of balance and symmetry. In fact, there is a great deal in your book which is about symmetry and asymmetry, and the link between science and the human experience. So, when you're talking about your father's part of the memoir, and even the fact that he has a limp, there's a lot of metaphoric use of that asymmetry in the body, asymmetry in society. It's a Punjabi background. And then there is a move to Canada, and all kinds of other experiences happen. So, in what way does the discipline of physics, and you mentioned the word fractals just now, how does this help you in plotting the memoir?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, yeah, you picked up on the theme of asymmetry. In fact, you know, the first working title of the book, before we came to this title, was The Asymmetric Heart. And I worked on with that for a very long time because I was dealing with the asymmetries of art and science, of the asymmetry across the two generations, my parents' generation and mine, first generation and second generation immigrants, the asymmetry of the partition itself, and the very violent consequences of the asymmetries that were caused by drawing that line. And yet, also because I am an ecologist, I'm aware of the biological necessity of asymmetry. In fact, humans, you look at our bodies and they look more or less symmetrical, but if you look inside and you look at our organs, they're all very asymmetrical. Our heart, the human heart, is asymmetrical, and it's asymmetrical through necessity. It evolved from symmetry to asymmetry. Asymmetry is actually allows for life and an ongoing process. So, I used all of those kind of scientific discoveries and knowledge to help really propel the writing, to keep it alive, to keep it, to avoid, cliches or neat conclusions or answers, because when you're writing about such complex, entwined things, I think what's more important to try to express is the wonder and discovery in what can appear on the page, rather than telling a neat history. So it doesn't fall into that genre of sort of journalism or history, and that's why so many disciplines had to come together to tell this story.
Talking of the complexity of the narrative, how do Canada and India get interlinked in your memoir? For instance, I found it absolutely wonderful the way you've brought in the multiculturalism of Canada as a kind of framework for the parents' journey, the next generation growing up in Canada, and then the third generation also being born and being brought up in Canada. So on one hand, there is this multicultural society. On the other hand, there are these microcosms of the Canadian Indians. There are other microcosms also of the First Nations people who are also called Indians by certain subsegments. There is the so-called mainstream Canadian. So there are the ideas of the interdisciplinary, multicultural floating in that narrative. And yet there are very acute observations and placements of the micro. So how did you integrate this multicultural Canada with the minuscule India that gets transported through migration?
It came very naturally. It came very naturally, and it came through my process of documenting the stories. So, what happened was, many years ago, I realized that I didn't know very much about the details of my parents' lives, and I just set forth on a process to try to get those stories down. At first, it was just transcribing by hand the oral, our oral conversations, oral histories, if you will. At some point, it became too much, and I started to record both my parents talking about their lives, both in India as children, in India through the partition, through their immigration, and their arranged marriage, many things. And what I found was that in that process, because for both of them, for different reasons, it was so difficult to tell certain parts of those stories. When things got difficult in just our normal interaction and in just our normal conversation, I would ask a detail. I would ask something about the microcosm, something as simple as what were the types of trees in the backyard? What was the brand of your bike? What color was it? There's all these little details that populate the book, but also I would say that those are the details that carry the story. And so those microcosmal moments in time and in space, because some of the stories take place in very remote areas. My parents spent time in very small towns, mining towns in Northern Ontario. The details of those, and some of those places I've now visited myself. Those are what carried it forward, what allowed for us to get through some of the difficult moments.
So this integration of the macro and the micro, and also you're placing signposts of Canadian history, juxtaposing it with the way your parents' lives developed in Canada. For instance, you talk about the centennial year of Canada, and then you talk about arrivals in specific cities such as Montreal, and then you talk about Toronto, you talk about small town Sudbury. So the integration of history and the personal biography of people, that again is a very fascinating aspect. So your own discipline is theoretical ecology. And like one of the characters in your novel, I want to ask you more about it. And also how your studies, your research in theoretical ecology, and also you're a poet. How does this help to shape this most experimental of memoirs that I have read in a long time? It's so different.
I think it's different because I really bring to it the lenses of both poetry and science. And, for whatever reasons, we don't have a lot of people doing that. So for me, it's very natural because that's who I am. And there's no other way for a writer to write than to bring their entire selves into what they're writing. I think whoever the writer is, whatever their backgrounds or aptitudes or abilities are. So I wrote it the way I think, the way I live. And so what that means is that I'm constantly carrying around with me a desire to know more and a desire to continue to wonder about things. And if you will, some might say these are the aspects of poetry and science, but for me, those things coexist in both. So in approaching, my parents' histories, and it was inevitable that to me they would be entwined with the history of the world, with our knowledge of everything, history, culture, science, because it was my curiosity that really brought all of those different things into it. It was also a way for me as one individual to try to grasp the magnitude of the terrain. The book does cover a huge time span, 80 years of time from when they were children in the 40s and present. It covers a vast geography that was, some of which was entirely new to me, that I had to imagine. India, Canada, both are huge geographies in and of themselves. So I had to find a way to anchor myself in those places, and so specific localities. I suppose what may have been new for others is that my approach to anchor myself in the world are often through scientific anchors. So that's where I would bring in, what was known scientifically about the world, let's say in the 40s when my parents were children, versus what is known now. To me, scientific history is entwined with human history, but we perhaps don't always look at them that way.
So within this human history that you're capturing, along with the personal history, it's also your emotional autobiography, isn't it? And I'm referring specially to the second part of the memoir, where you speak about your mother, who is fading in her health, particularly in her memory. And with this failing condition, she's writing little notes to herself. There's a scrambling of time recall. And you, as the daughter, are attempting to declutter her home, her cupboards, her life, and trying to find a new equation with a mother who may not even recognize those who are close and intimate and known to her. So in those moments of acute emotional experience, what role does your scientific understanding of life, of the cosmos, of the world, have to do with encountering the death of parents? They're very beautiful and very moving passages there. How did you deal with that kind of a situation where you have the knowledge of what happens to the human body, but at the same time, they're parents, and how does one let them go?
So my parents are still alive. I do want to say that. And also, I think you're referring to one particular episode where we had a bit of a scare because my mother was showing some signs of delusion, but in fact, her memory is still very intact. She does recognize us. Unfortunately, through some falls, and we realized after the fact that she had had a stroke, she can no longer really speak well, and she can no longer walk well. So, yeah, it's been a very, very, difficult time these past couple of years. In fact, when the book came out in June of 2020, my mother was in the hospital again, and I couldn't see her because of the pandemic. And I'm realizing now, I realized then that if I had tried to sort of start the project even a year later than let's just say if I tried to start it now, it would be impossible, because she can't speak. for long periods of time, and she can't speak in a free-flowing way. I think, I don't think that being a scientist helps me deal with grief or grieving or death any more than it does for anybody else. I don't think that type of knowledge helps with those things. Yeah, I think I would leave it at that, because I think there, perhaps, yeah, I think I have to leave it at that. I don't think that knowledge of science can help. I mean, one thing that I think is true is that the approach that I did take with writing this book, I'm hesitant to say it because it sounds like there was foresight there, but I don't think there was. The impetus for starting to write it was in fact 2015, when my mother had a heart attack. She was still very healthy, but that was the first moment of encountering her mortality. And it was the first time in my life that I, realized that we could lose her, that day. And that was the awakening for me, in terms of realizing that I didn't know very much about her, and I needed to find out many things.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to wait any longer. So that's what started the process. I do personally feel that writing the book prepared me in a way to grieve, if one can call grieving something before it's gone, even before it's gone. Yeah, that was just my way of doing it, I suppose.
So let me push this towards a larger question of the book possibly being an exploration of understanding what Canadianness means for Indian immigrants. Because within the book, you do mention that depending on the context, Indians identify by the country where they came from. But if there are large numbers of immigrants in, say, big cities like Toronto, then they divide themselves up by religion or city or language. And there's a lot of the Punjabi language, for instance, referred to in your book. There are old terms from the small town existence that comes into the vocabulary, colloquial terms, friendly banter. And there's a lot of that Punjabiyat, if I can put it that way. So what is the book saying about the creation of a Canadian identity for the immigrants that come? Because you're looking at 3 generations. What is the process that happens? And is there a sense of a Canadian identity? And if so, what is it?
Identity for me is something very, very personal and unique. So if there's anything that I think the book will show for readers is, on the one hand, just how individual and particular identity building is for people, how complex it is, in the sense that we are all made of many parts, and we bring those multitudes to whatever it is we encounter. I think that putting together, geographies, timescales, poetry, science, history, by looking at all of those different disciplines, it can actually help us to recognize that identity is not a particular place. It's not a particular time. It's something that integrates all of those things. At the same time, and perhaps it's interesting that like very specific things can help bridge identities from one person to the next. And we never know what those things will be. We don't know if it will be a mathematical equation or a particular, way of cooking something, or witnessing a particular moment in history. So those are the things I thought were interesting. And when I have been presenting this book at many festivals, and when many people who have read the book, who are second generation immigrants, both from the Indian subcontinent, but from many other places, have told me that they identify with the stories. And these are people that are second generation, but even people who are first generation immigrants who are reading this, who have very different histories, told me that they identify with the book. And so, yeah, I think I'm interested in the commonalities that of human experience, basically. That, what are the commonalities there?
Interesting when you talk about the commonalities and that so many people said that they identified with the experience. Yes, there is a very humanistic strand in the book, very intense, very attractive and beautifully written. So is there a part of the book or some parts of the book that you'd like to mention that you really enjoyed writing? Writing is not always an easy process. It never is, actually. But yet, writers always say, well, this section or this episode or this memory came to me more easily, and it almost wrote itself. Did something like that happen?
It was really the most amazing thing. I feel the entire book wrote itself. This is my first book of prose, and I'm going to show it to you because I'm not sure people will have seen the structure. So this is the cover that you sort of see usually, and it's I call it the first partition. And this is the section where when you open it up, it starts with my mother's voice in the first person. I made a decision to write my parents' stories in the first person, which was an unusual thing to do. So those stories alternate my mother's voice, my father's voice, and that takes up about half of the book. And then in the middle of the book, you encounter some documents from their lives that we've copied. And then you get upside down text. So you actually have to flip the book over, and that's my side, where those are the stories in my voice in the first person. And I had been thinking about the book. I had been recording my parents. I had been figuring out how to deal with the fact that I would be telling their stories on their behalf, which was also something I had to figure out because of those partitions that I wanted to reflect in the storytelling as well. When it came time to actually write the book, because I had a very limited amount of time in which to write it, in a sense, because I am a professor, a full-time professor of ecology, and I have a very busy other life with my family and 3 children. So I had a concentrated time in which to write it, and it sort of, I was basically writing like a chapter a week. And was it enjoyable? Only in the sense that it felt that it felt good to get something on the page that was in my head for a long period of time. But I didn't even know if what I was writing was good. And I would be sending it to my editor in real time, and she's like, yep, keep going. And then it was done.
Madhur, read a little bit, please. Maybe from the beginning.
Sure.
A few lines would be wonderful.
Which beginning?
The mother's beginning.
Mother's beginning. Okay. The little chapter is titled Aap Biti versus Jug Biti. The story goes more or less like this. A nobleman is out hunting with his hawk. The hawk gets him a crane, which he throws into a bag to bring back to his villa to have cooked for his dinner. The nobleman's cook has a friend who, unable to resist the smell of the cooking bird, begs the cook to give him one of the crane's legs to eat. When the nobleman sees the cooked crane with the missing leg on his plate, he asks the cook about it. The cook insists that the crane had only one leg to begin with. The cook tries to prove his point by taking the nobleman back to the river where the crane was hunted. They come upon a number of cranes in the water, standing on one leg, asleep. The cook says, "See, they all have only one leg." The nobleman yells, "Shoo!" and the cranes put down their second legs and fly away. The nobleman scolds the cook, but the cook then asks the nobleman, "Why did you not yell shoo at the dinner table earlier today? How do you know for sure that the cooked crane would not also reveal its second leg to you then? You see, you have wasted my time, sir." The nobleman accepts the cook's wit in exchange for his forgiveness. I have never heard of Giovanni Boccaccio, the man who wrote this story, entitled A Witty Answer, which I read in my Radiant Reading book in Dehradun when I was 16. It is full of words I did not know: trust, refusal, obliged, wrath, impudence. The truth is, 3 of 5 of these words I still do not know. The story is one of 100 tales from a book called The Decameron, set in Florence in 1350. It was the time of the Black Death, my daughter tells me. I have a vague idea of where Italy is now, because my daughter took me there when I was already an old woman. It was Venice, and she made me taste red wine for the second time in my life and listen to a classical concert of Mozart in a very old church. I listened, but I did not like it. I tried to hide that fact from my daughter, but she saw me asleep. I said it was from the wine, but she knew I had only had 3 sips. I still do not know what the Black Death is, but it sounds worse than partition. Excuse me, do you want to hear Abiti or Jagbiti? My version or the version written by others?
Thank you very much. That's a delightful sample of the book and what it contains. And I particularly want to focus, as we come towards the end of the session, on this beautiful act of storytelling. It's so much a part of the Punjabi inheritance, but it's also very much a part of the Canadian legacy. And so the Canadian writers are wonderful storytellers, the First Nations people, and their mythologies, their stories. Used to read a lot of that. So the act of storytelling itself is just magical. And you've captured that, and where we are located in history, Boccaccio and Decameron are extremely relevant when we talk about the Black Death today. So that, to me, is a marvelous bridge between the stories of the past and your story of the present, stories of India and your location in Canada and that of the younger generation. So it's a wonderful, successful memoir, unusual, brilliantly structured. What is your next project, or is it a secret?
Well, I do have a second book of poems coming out in March of 2022. I just received the first pages of it actually this past week. So I'm really excited to share that. It's entitled Parasitic Oscillations, and it examines many things. It's inspired by a 19th century text of it's entitled The Nests and Eggs of Indian Birds by A.O. Hume. I don't know if you have ever heard of it. I had never heard of him or of his work, but he's the so-called father of ornithology of India. And I encountered that text, which, because it's a 19th century text that's kind of written in a half poetic, half scientific style. I was absolutely fascinated with it, and it took me on a journey of physically to the UK, to India, to the US, to actually look at these eggs, which are still in existence. He collected them himself, and they're still in museums. And I have a book of poems coming out about that.
That sounds very promising indeed, Madhur, and I'm sure is going to be experimental, exciting, stimulating, and most engrossing as your writing is. So indeed, a great pleasure talking to you, wishing you all the best, and warm congratulations for this very thoughtful, thought-provoking book of memoirs that you have published, and that has been received so appreciatively in Canada, in India, and all over the world. I hand you back to our host for the evening.
Thank you, Madhur and Malashri, for a riveting journey into science, history, and poetry. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available at Boulder Bookstore. If you like the session, do consider supporting us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. We sincerely value your contributions. Once again, we would like to thank all our official partners. We hope you all enjoyed these conversations and will tune back in for our next session, Unraveling the Middle East. Edaf Soif, Gideon Levy, and Raja Shehade in conversation with Manisha Ganguly at 3 p.m. MDT, 2:30 a.m. IST, 4 p.m. CT, 2 p.m. PT, and 5 p.m. ET. Thank you once again, and stay tuned for a reading from the JLF Writer Shorts.
I'm so happy to be here to launch a new woman superhero. As a little girl growing up in this country with not too much out there to inspire me, I loved Wonder Woman. I mean, she always fought for justice and peace. She could repel bullets with her magical bracelets. And I really think that Priya and the Wolves it will be and is a version of that for little girls and for boys all over the world. So I'm so pleased to be here to launch this wonderful new comic book that's written by my friend Ruchira Gupta and illustrated by Melanconi. The comic is a reimagination of the classic fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood, but set in India during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when millions of migrants walked back to their villages and therefore hopefully to safety. It highlights the vulnerability of women and girls to sex traffickers during this time of walking and being especially vulnerable to the world. Ruchira has been running a food drive called 1 Million Meals via her NGO, Opniop, to provide rations to millions of at-risk and trafficked women and girls across India. Opniop's mission is to create a world in which no girl or woman is bought or sold. This comic tells the story of female vulnerability, but also of female courage and how we can all help each other. Courage is contagious. I dedicate this comic to all those courageous women who have helped themselves by helping each other.
Hello, I'm Ruchira. I'm the founder of Apne Aap. Our organization works against sex trafficking. Priya and the Wolves is an outcome of my experiences in the last 1 year. It literally is based on true life. I did see thousands of women and their families migrate back, walking on highways for hundreds of kilometers in the heat with no food. One woman died from dehydration, and her child was playing next to her on a railway platform. So there were all kinds of stories, and I tried to give food in the middle of all of that because they had no food. I also got panic messages from children, from very young girls, and from mothers who were contemplating suicide, saying they had no food in the red light areas. And we literally created a human chain of students and volunteers and transporters and merchants to get just basic food supplies like rice and dal and salt and spices into the red light areas to these last girls, as I call them.
I'm Connie Michelle Molina. My artist name is The Melancholy, and I am in Bogota, Colombia. And I am the artist behind Priya and the Wolves. This is the cover for art. This was inspired in the golden era of comics in drawings by the 60s or 50s in Marvel Comics. I have my Marvel encyclopedia right here helping me out to draw. I chose this palette of colors, which was really unexpected and strange, because I felt like I had to travel through my emotions and the emotions that I think Rishma was feeling while drawing all this, while living all this. So I chose very specific colors that are shocking, that transmit uneasiness, awkwardness, fear. And I think it's a spiritual travel through abuse, through fear, through oppression, through vulnerability. And this color palette helps the reader go through the concept that Ruchira wanted to put into this comic. We will give you food if you play with us. Take off your mask.
Please, sir, why should I take off my mask?
The better to see you, my dear. The better to eat with, my dear.
Please, sir, I can't take off this mask. It'll keep the virus out. It's magical.
We will take you to a place with no masks. You will have money to send home.
Festival like this is a beautiful indication of the kind of thing that I truly, truly believe in, and I think makes our society more whole and more pure.
We do not take it for granted that Boulder was chosen as the first North American satellite festival. It's a huge honor we will not forget, and we are enriched because of it. We are indebted to both the local and international people that came together to make that happen, and we hope it's a tradition that continues for decades to come.
Literary festivals like this one build up an environment and an ecosystem to nurture readers and to promote the business of books. They provide an invaluable forum for writers to connect with other creative people.
We sit there peering into those electronic grids in front of our eyes, and it only increases the desire to see the real thing in the flesh. To actually hear an author speak firsthand, to read from their work, to hear the tones of their voice modulate as they read their most treasured passages of prose.
For us, it's special. This was our mothership, and it continues to be. The other editions that we have across the United States are smaller versions, different programming, but smaller versions.
In a sense to me, religion and art are the same thing. They're vaguely irrational, but they help make sense of things. Someone who lives with no arts and no religion has very little to live on.
2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom.
You have to think of viruses as intelligent machines, as code crackers. And like all living forms, they have to adapt to their environment.
Imagination is a powerful tool. It doesn't matter which part of the world we are in our situation. Are we behind locked bars? Are we roaming freely? Independent thought and process. Our imagination allows us to soar out of any present circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that really is the power of literature and the written word. It allows us to envision a better future. It allows us to consider our past and make sense of the present. Imagination is a tool to be able to free us from the binds and the constrictions that we find ourselves locked into. We can break free. We can soar through the universe. We can rise up into the darkened night like a firefly, illuminating the world. This is what JLF Boulder, Colorado hopes to bring you, something to fire your imagination.